Chapter 35. Benzene. The Red Maiden drank the bitter cup of henbane the old woman offered her. She flexed her forearms and stretched out her wrists, balling her fists and rotating them in tight circles. She could feel the dormant strength in her muscles, all fatigue gone. She was ready. The old woman looked in her eyes. Her face crinkled into a warm smile. "It's almost time, Gunhilda. You ready, my Red Maiden?" Gunhilda nodded, enthusiastic, eager beneath the calm exterior. "Good. The way is prepared. Go forth now and conquer." The Red Maiden stood, her hand axe in her right hand and a Carolingian sword in her left. She walked calmly toward the lodge's door. She shouldered past the caribou hide that hung there. As she stepped out into the darkness, she blinked. Then she was falling upward, as if the earth had released its gravitational hold on her, casting her off its mass, untethered into the cold, oxygenless void. When Gunhilda opened her eyes, breath roared down into her dry lungs. She found herself flat on her back, staring up at a wood-slatted ceiling lit by the last reflections of sunset. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore. She was not alone. Before her, calmly chewing on a mouthful of hay, was a massive white, grey and black Andalusian stallion. The horse watched her impassively as he swallowed his dinner, as if nothing was amiss. The Red Maiden looked down at her body. Her hands, again, were not her own. But Leonie's hands seemed strong enough. She stood in Leonie's bloodless body and stretched out the kinks. She approached the horse and reached out to stroke his jawline. Joshua leaned into her affection, nuzzling her hand. The Red Maiden studied the stirrups and saddle. She had ridden Icelandic horses from childhood, but had never seen a horse the size and shape of Joshua. This was a horse bred for war, she was certain, and war was her purpose. The old woman made that clear. She searched through the barn for a weapon and found nothing but a hay fork. It felt heavy and unwieldy. She cast it aside. If her time in Amiens and the surrounding land taught her anything, there would be plenty of weapons when the time came. What she needed to do now was ride, join the hunt, and seek her prey. Between now and the finding, she was confident that the tools with which to murder them would present themselves in abundance. Isaiah could hear Francois's warning cry to their fellows at the MG nest. It came as a rumbling bellow back through the tunnel, indistinct and distant. Moments later, Isaiah and Betty reached the supply barges at the central wall. Isaiah turned the wick of his lantern down until the kerosene flame extinguished. He sat it on the ground, grabbed the wheel of the lower lock gate and spun it. Unlike the one blocked by the sunken corpses, it rolled easily, and the gate opened wide, allowing the water from the lock to flow down toward the tunnel exit. Isaiah ran past the first few barges and leapt up onto the fuel barge. He scrambled across the deck to the first large cylindrical tank. The word Benzene was painted in block letters above the tap. Isaiah unwound a black rubber hose secured to the tap and tossed the spout into the canal. He spun the valve lever open and watched the hose belch gasoline into the canal. He ran across the deck and did the same with the second fuel tank, eyes tearing, lungs choking from the toxic fumes that flowed into the tunnel. As they jumped down onto the pathway, the last barge before the central concrete wall held the armory. He jogged down to it. As he put his hands on the deck rail, he stopped sharp. He could have sworn someone said his name. Behind Isaiah, Black Betty's growl rumbled in her chest. He glanced back. She was staring at the door in the wall, hackles rising, teeth baring, distant thunder in her throat. The door remained wedged shut behind the hauling tractor. Isaiah moved toward it slowly, his steps silent. The mastiff stopped growling. Isaiah froze. Someone was testing the door. It was gentle at first. Then the door slammed open an inch and banged sharply against the barge hauler. Isaiah backed away. Then the door began slamming against the hauler, violent, chaotic, and there were other noises, rage and anger, shrieking laughter. A mob of murder held back by the steel door. The mastiff began barking. Isaiah grabbed the dead lantern off the tracks, turned and ran. Black Betty caught up with him 100 yards later. As his boots pounded the concrete, Isaiah wondered if he had made a monumental error in judgment. The gas he dumped into the canal was filling the air as much as it was the water. He feared he would collapse from the fumes before he had a chance to escape. Then, the clatter of a machine gun fire erupted 2,000 yards away. He hoped to Christ the rounds would not ignite the very air he was running through. When Francois and James reached the MG position, they brought chaos with them. The others were on their feet in response to Francois's warning cries, except for Halstead, still spent from Caitlin's doctoring, and Jonah, who kept the MG-08 and his eyes on the exterior approach. Durant and Renoir met Francois on the path. James was not far behind, eyes wide in terror. He caught up and bent over, gasping for breath. "Le mort, sous-marine," Francois spat out. "Dead men in the canal," Renoir translated. "Combien, Francois?" "Hundreds," shouted James. "There gotta be hundreds of them." "Where's that boy Isaiah?" Donnie McMaster asked. "He's trying to stop him," James said. "Told us he'd catch us if we followed the river out of here. Come on," James pleaded. "Let's go before they wake up." Caitlin picked up Isaiah's shotgun. Wolfgang grabbed a Mauser off the wall rack. "Durant, go. Jonah and I will hold them with a machine gun as long as we can." Durant nodded. "Nurse O'Leary, can you and Francois help Dr. Halstead?" Caitlin nodded. She shouldered the shotgun and its bag of spare shells. Francois grabbed the rucksack of medical supplies and pulled it on. Then he and Caitlin took Halstead's hands and helped him up. "Copperlonger!" Wolfgang yelled. Jonah glanced back. "We'll bring the machine gun around." Jonah stood. Wolfgang put the Mauser over his shoulder and grabbed the front legs of the MG tripod. Together they dragged it, shrieking as the metal scraped on the concrete until they had it faced back up the canal. Finbar glanced at the rifle rack, but with the wreckage of his hand, the rifle would be useless. When he reached the door, he lifted the beam with his good hand, chucking it aside. Then the door was open. Frigid winter air rolled in as he ran out. Durant looked at Donnie. Donnie stood beside James, clasping the Mauser he had taken, searching the tunnel, fear in his eyes, and something else that Durant could not quite name. Adolf was next to Donnie, frozen on the spot, staring through his gauze wrappings into the tunnel. Durant grabbed James's shoulder and nodded toward Adolf. "Can you lead him out of here? James realized that Durant was talking about the blind fellow. Sure. Donnie, can you help me? Donnie still stared down the tunnel. He chewed his lip. He had a task that was incomplete. What about that black boy? James wanted to shake Donnie out of his stupor. Isaiah? Isaiah can take care of himself for sure. Help me with his blind Jerry, all right? Let's get out of here. Donnie shook his head, as if responding to a voice inside of him. Then he nodded. He grabbed one of Adolph's arms and yanked him toward the exit. James took his other arm, and together they dragged him out the door. Caitlin and Francois came after, with Halstead between them. Where do we go? She asked Durant. Durant took the second-to-last Mauser down. He chambered around, flicked the safety, and slung it. Without thinking, he echoed Grigori's last words. Verdun. Get them to Verdun. Cross the river, then south. Go on. Wolfgang watched as Caitlin and Francois led Halstead out. Little Rupert Fuchs followed them. He saw Renoir grab the lost Mauser from the rack. Renoir put it to his cheek and sighted over the barrel, scanning the far end of the tunnel for any movement. The tunnel ran straight for 900 meters before bending away. There was nothing coming. Yet. As Wolfgang watched, it all fit into place like a puzzle piece, turned and turned until it clicked, unexpected, into its slot cleanly, bringing the entire picture into sharp focus. Renoir, rifles to his cheek, staring down the sights, was the living image the demon had shown him when he gave him a window into Sebastian's final moments. He knew in that instant that the story of Sebastian's demise the demon spat into his ear was truth. Renoir lowered the rifle. He looked over at Wolfgang and Jonah on the machine gun. He and Wolfgang made eye contact for a millionth of a second. Then Renoir was through the door. The moment was gone, and the only thing real was the canvas belt filled with its heavy cascade of brass and lead feeding up into the mouth of the MG-08. Wolfgang. Wolfgang looked up. Durant was staring into the tunnel. Let's go. Durant looked down at him and Jonah. There's no point in you staying here and dying. We can fight them on the run if we have to. Whatever Francois and James saw down there may not even be able to rise. Wolfgang looked back down the tunnel. No one coming. He turned to reply to Durant when Jonah let out a sharp hiss and the tunnel filled with the roar of the machine gun. The cloth belt and its metal cargo were nearly yanked from his hand as the MG devoured cartridges and spat rounds down the tunnel. Isaiah and the dog slowed as they approached the barge hauler, blocking the stairwell to the generator. There was no sign of anything trying to get through it. Isaiah took little comfort from that. He released the handbrake, got behind the hauler, and dug in, pushing it along the tracks until the door was clear. He listened intently, then opened the door. There was no one waiting behind it to beat and lynch him. Just the silent staircase spiraling up. The MG continued its bark, frenetic in the distance. The gasoline flowing down the canal caught up with them again, and its fumes enveloped the position. Isaiah set the unlit lantern on the bottommost step of the spiral staircase. He backed away and turned, leading the Mastiff down the tunnel toward the gunfire at a fast clip. When they turned the last bend and approached the flotilla of barges that lay in the water above the lock, Isaiah slowed. Black Betty read Isaiah's intent and heeled next to him, moving with caution. Isaiah saw no movement. At the upper lock gate, he looked down into the water beside the barge. It was clear. There was no proof that the dead had lain on the bottom 10 minutes ago. Either they had never been there, or they had risen and gone. From the MG burst 1,000 yards down the canal, Isaiah figured plainly on the latter. He grabbed the big metal wheel and turned it. All impediments gone, it spun freely now. Turning the gears and opening the gate, it swung wide, and the gas-slicked water flowed through, pouring down into the lock. Isaiah was nauseous and dizzy. He put his sleeve over his mouth to filter the fumes of poison for what little good it did. He focused his mind and hustled down the mule path to the lower gate. The machine gun was still roaring away. Isaiah figured it must be that boy Jonah on the beast. Whoever it was, it impressed him how long they were holding up. Isaiah grabbed the lower gate's wheel and spun it wide. The gasoline and water flowed through the open gate. As the gate reached its outer limit, the barge in the lock caught the current and began to float slowly down the canal toward the exit. The machine gun went silent. Isaiah listened, splashing and shrieks of joy in the distance. Fuck. Isaiah turned and raced back the way he'd come, Black Betty at his side, both of them choking on the fuel-air mixture as they ran upstream into its overwhelming fumes. Jonah squeezed the trigger and swept the water 900 meters distant, just ahead of where the canal curved away around the bend. The MG was well within its effective range, and Jonah's hands were steady. He was accustomed to the deafening roar of the gun, and had lost enough hearing from his time spent behind an MG to find the cocoon of white noise comforting. The void of aural input it caused focused his vision. He had not actually seen them coming. It had been almost imperceptible at first. The reflection of the string bulbs caught a subtle change in the shape of the water's surface. Jonah knew that something was moving beneath it. He pulled the trigger on pure instinct. The rounds covered the 900 meters in 1 second, zipping into the water. He held the range there in front of where he had seen motion and swept the gun back and forth. Wolfgang yelled, "Durant, go!" And Jonah saw Durant disappear from his periphery, running out the door after the others. Wolfgang fed the MG and attached a second 250-round belt, while Jonah kept up a steady maximum rate of fire for a full minute until the second belt was nearly depleted too. Jonah paused. He stared downrange. Wolfgang pulled another belt out and latched it to the MG's feed. Jonah's breath came in sharply through his nose as he scanned the tunnel. Silence and still water. Had he been firing at ghosts, at figments of his imagination? If he had squandered 450-some rounds for nothing, he would feel an utter fool. Wolfgang finished locking in the belt and tapped Jonah's shoulder. Jonah nodded acknowledgement without looking away from the water at the canal bend. Then he saw it. The flicker of shadows cast on the wall above the mule path. A pack of men rounded the corner, and the water burst to life too as dead men surfaced and began rushing through the canal toward them. In the dozens, they pulled themselves onto the path, joining the charge, sprinting toward Jonah and Wolfgang. Jonah opened fire, expertly slicing rounds into the men on the path at waist level and below, knocking their legs out from under them, forcing the rear ranks to climb over their disabled comrades. When he'd cut the path runners down, he swung the sights back into the water and sent a steady fusillade sweeping back and forth, trying to slow their passage through the canal. When Isaiah and the Mastiff got to the spiral staircase, the petrol fume's intensity had grown. Isaiah coughed and choked back bile. He grabbed his lantern. He paused, listening for any sound coming down through the vortexing stairs. Nothing. If there was anything up there, he could not hear it over the echo of the MG. Black Betty growled. He shushed her and strained again to hear what she was sensing. Again, nothing. When he glanced back at her, he saw that her focus was not aimed up the stairs. Her animosity and fear aimed up the canal tunnel. in the direction of the barge that was draining its poisonous cargo into the canal. As they stepped back onto the walkway, looked up the canal toward the fuel barge and the armory, listening intently. No sound echoed back to him from whatever had been trying to breach the blocked door, but Black Betty's teeth bared and her ears cocked back as his heart rate spiked. He could sense it too. Something was coming. He grabbed the master by her collar and pulled her into the stairwell as they shut the door quietly, then moved, quick as he could, up the stairs with her in tow. The MG regained its momentum in the distance. As unarmed as he was, he hoped like hell whatever was coming down the tunnel would be drawn by the lure of the machine gun fire and skip investigation of the staircase. His hope was unfounded. Wolfgang fed the gun and latched in a fourth belt. He thought they might hold the position after all. Jonah's skill was keeping them at bay. They had not closed more than 50 yards toward the gun, and each one that tried to escape the maddening fire hitting the water was cut down within moments of climbing onto the pathway. The canal itself was not wide enough for the monsters to get an edge on them, so a frontal assault was all they could hope to attempt. The Maschinengewehr Art 8 was built to stymie precisely that. If Jonah kept his focus and the gun did not overheat, they could hold them back for a good long while. Wolfgang looked over at the door behind him, to his right. The thing he had to fear now was something coming up on them from the rear. Wolfgang grabbed another belt and attached it to the ribbon of bullets that was being yanked through his hand. Steam from the cooling can was venting into mist around the barrel, but the water can was still half full. Jonah loosed a long, uninterrupted burst as more demons tried to climb out of the canal onto the path. His rounds hit them low and knocked their feet out from under them. There were shrieks of frustration and rage. Jonah sent an additional burst toward them. Then the machine gun jammed. Jonah grabbed the advance lever and ratcheted it hard twice, but it did not clear the chamber. Wolfgang's stomach knotted. He looked down the tunnel. For a moment, the distant water was still. Then a wave of motion stirred beneath it, and the mass of men in the water surged toward them. Jonah! Yeah, a moment. Jonah worked the latch and opened the receiver. The cartridge belt was bunched into it, a misfired squib round. It jammed tight in the receiver, just outside the barrel's throat. Wolfgang saw a gang of the coming men scramble up onto the path and run toward them. He unslung his rifle, aimed, and got off a shot. It hit the first man in the onrushing mob, but passed straight through him, not phasing him. Jonah, can you fix it? Jonah reached into the hot gun, tried to pry the unexploded cartridge free. It burned his fingers and he yanked his hand away. He looked up at the coming monsters. They'd covered 100 yards. More were climbing out and running with the pack onto the concrete pathway. No, I can't fix it, Jonah said. Then let's go, Wolfgang shouted. Jonah stood and backed away from the machine gun, eyes on the screaming line of men coming for them. The distinct scent of gasoline reached his nostrils. He followed Wolfgang out the door. They sprinted into the night. The 500-meter lead they had on their pursuers felt as thin as gossamer silk. Isaiah and Black Betty took the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time. When they were halfway up, Isaiah froze. The door below crashed open on its hinges. He stayed still, listening, straining to hear if something was following them or passing by. When he heard boots on steps, he abandoned any attempt at stealth. He ran the stairs as fast as he could. Whatever was coming behind heard them. The sounds of bloodthirsty joy coming from the pursuers echoed up the stairwell, spurring him. Black Betty burst through the door to the generator room with Isaiah inches behind her, heedless of anything that might wait for them there. The killers coming up the stairs after them were all he could wrap his mind around for now. He kicked the door shut and cut across the room. He grabbed a mass of fire rags from the box next to the coal pile and shoved them inside his jacket, then ran for the stairwell that led up to the manor's kitchen. As he hit the first step, he saw the door he'd kicked shut burst open. Men in wet German uniforms, damp hair plastered to their too pale faces, crashed through. They saw Isaiah disappear up the stairs, and streamed after him. Isaiah followed Black Betty through the door into the kitchen of the lock-keeper's house. He dropped the lantern beside the kerosene can he had discarded there, and slammed the door shut. He grabbed the deadbolt and fumbled with it. It was seized open. A layer of paint had frozen the bolt in its bracket. Isaiah hauled back and hit the head of it with the palm of his hand. The bolt broke free and slid home as, bam! The weight of a man crashed into the door from the other side. Isaiah stepped back from the door. Bam! The door shuttered in the jam. Bam! The hinges vibrated with the hit. Bam! The deadbolt's latch began to give way. Isaiah fumbled open the kerosene can. He picked up the lantern. Bam! He backed away, splashing the kerosene behind him. Black Betty was barking fiercely. Bam! At the doorway to the dining room, Isaiah pulled a fire rag out. Shaking fingers slid open the Vulcan matches. The first one's head snapped as he struck it. He struck a second one, and it took. He touched it to the corner of the fire rag. It ignited in a flash of blue flames. Bam! The deadbolt's catch splintered out of the frame and flew across the room. The door burst open. Isaiah dropped the fire rag onto the kitchen floor. The fumes lit and burst, racing back across the old wooden floors in a fireball that engulfed the kitchen. The instantaneous explosion of the fuel-air mixture knocked Isaiah back. He felt its heat singe his eyelashes and face, but he paid it no mind. The kitchen went inferno as the wood floor's finish caught fire, and the ancient dry oak underneath took the flame. The fire held the demons at bay. As Isaiah backed up, the dead man at the doorway stared through the flames at him, hesitant. Then it ran into the fire. Instantly the wool uniform caught, but the demon kept running. His hair burned, and the flesh beneath it took, but it kept coming. Isaiah stumbled backward as it hit the entryway into the dining room. It tripped over the jam, stumbling and falling face first to the ground. It lay still, smoking and smouldering on the floor. Isaiah looked back into the burning kitchen. There was no movement in the black void of the door that led down to the generator room. The flames had taken the kitchen. They leapt around the door frame and into the dining room. Isaiah stood, turned, and ran. When Ganan awoke, he was terrified. He was covered in a layer of cold, white powder. The snow tumbled down from a light purplish sky in big, meaty flakes. Ganan sat up and brushed it off his face and shoulders. Resting across his lap, he found a German cavalryman's lance. He hefted it and knocked the snow away. It felt good in his hands, with a much better weight and balance than the makeshift spear he had used to bring down Halstead. As he came fully to, he saw that he was on the edge of a large field blanketed in snowfall. Suddenly, all around him, the white field came to life as a great mass of men began awakening and rising up just as Ganan had. Ganan stood and looked out over the rising congregation. There had to be thousands of them. Ganan had never seen so many people gathered together at any point in his life. It took long minutes, but soon they were all standing, dusted with snow and ice. They seemed as much in a daze as Ganan, searching for something, not knowing quite what they were waiting for. and then she appeared on the horizon, galloping toward them on her pale horse with its flowing black mane. As one, the battalions in the field knew that this one had come to guide them onward. The Red Maiden reined in before the sea of risen men. She rode directly to the bloody body of Crown Prince Ruprecht. She held out her hand. Ruprecht took a step forward and turned his saber over, offering her the hilt. She took it in hand and raised the blade in salute. Ganan felt a surge of exultation fill him. It flowed through the entirety of the battalions. Their leader had found them. The Red Maiden kicked her stallion's flanks, and the Andalusian danced forward. She wended her way through the field of men until she came to Ganan. She reined in Joshua and took stock of the man before her. "Ganan," she said. It was not a question. He nodded, humbled that someone so magnificent and beautiful knew his name. She nodded to him. "Come." Ganan did not speak Norse, but he understood. Leonie tapped Joshua's flanks and wheeled him. The horse leapt forward, launching into a gallop. Without hesitation, Ganan and the 6,000 ran behind, following in her steps. The night's hunt had begun.